Welcome back to the Woodworking Talk Show. If you are woodworking curious and looking for a step-by-step approach to woodworking from the ground up, you know, Rex, have you ever known anybody to start woodworking from the ceiling down?
Never once, although I suppose if you get into carpentry first, it's conceivable.
If you're looking to get started in a fun hobby that'll last you for a lifetime, I have a course designed just for you. No experience necessary. It's called The Weekend Woodworker. Be sure to download my free guide showing you how to get all the tools you'll need for less than $1,000. Head over to mytoollist.com and download it today. Or Rex Krueger is a YouTuber, an author, a historian, and a woodworker. Although we're going to discover that there is really no such thing as a woodworker. Or is there? He builds mostly traditional furniture in a mostly traditional manner using mostly traditional tools. He's a leading advocate for ditching power tools and returning to a simpler time of human-powered construction. Rex posted his first video to YouTube in March of 2017, giving us a tour of his toolbox. And honestly, that's the kind of unboxing video that I like to see. Do you still use that toolbox?
I mean, I don't, because I no longer work for other people. That's when I was working at furniture shops. And since I kind of have hand tool woodworker brain, I would get to shops and they wouldn't have some of the some shops didn't have chisels, and my brain just locks up because I know how to use all the machinery. I was all power tool when I started, but like I don't know how to make a project without a chisel. Like my brain won't do that. So I just started bringing stuff because it was easier than getting in a fight with the boss over tools that I thought he should have.
Since posting that toolbox video, Rex has made videos showing how to make workbenches, how to use and make traditional hand tools as well as restore them. He has a few furniture projects and some of my absolute favorite videos on the entire platform of YouTube, Furniture Forensics, where he examines an old piece of furniture to reveal telltale signs of how it was built and why, and probably by whom. If you're interested in the history of woodworking and how that can help you to better understand your own woodworking, Rex Krueger is an amazing resource. No table saw necessary. Hey, Rex, welcome to the show.
That was a great introduction. Thank you. I'm very touched to hear that some of my videos are among your favorites. That's lovely. Thank you.
Oh, man, those furniture forensics are fantastic. I mean, they're so interesting. And for anybody listening to this who hasn't seen those, I highly suggest you go check those out. And what Rex does is he finds, I guess in some cases, you find this furniture like on the side of the road. It's basically old discarded furniture, and you take it into your shop and, well, you could tell the story and kind of examine what went into building this.
You know, the first time I got the idea, I was actually at my brother and sister-in-law's house, and they have a very Pottery Barn aesthetic, and everything in their house is new. And I was in one of their side rooms, and they had like a little bar cabinet to hold bottles and stuff. And it was, you know, made overseas and obviously made in a factory. And I was just sitting there having a drink, looking at it and thinking, oh, they used a Forstner bit to do this, and they angled this. And, oh, they must have come in with a horizontal boring machine to do this part over there. And that actually gave me the idea. The original idea was to do it with factory furniture, modern factory furniture, and talk about like, oh, how would you make this in a factory setting? And then I walked out my front door one day, and my new neighbors had put a bunch of furniture on the sidewalk. And I have the sickness. If somebody puts out junk, I want to go look at it, and some of it might come home. And I looked at a table, and I was like, oh, wow, this is a handmade table. And just instantly I was like, oh, that idea that I had, I need to apply that to this. And that would be an amazing video. And then it did well for me, and I had a lot of fun making it. So I've got 3 of those now, and I'm very fortunate to live in Northern Ohio. I live in Cleveland, Ohio. There's a great tradition of handmade furniture around here, especially stuff that was made by working class people, and there's a ton of it still around because people hang on to stuff. And so it hasn't been, COVID made it really hard, but it hasn't been super difficult to find pieces that I can bring back to the shop because I need them for a couple days to figure out what I'm going to say. There's actually a lot of me laying underneath it with a flashlight and a notepad because it takes a long time to kind of get the story together. It takes like probably 12, 15 hours of staring at a piece to really figure out how things were done.
It's fascinating. For instance, probably your most recent one was a chair, and I learned a lot about chair construction that I would have never have known, at least this kind of traditional chair construction, which would have been made with green wood. Is that right? And so they had to account for not just the contraction and the shrinkage of the wood, but like which direction that was going to be. So like the turned pieces are no longer round; they're like oval. So and they accounted for that, which is fascinating stuff.
Not just accounted for it, but used it. So those holes they would drill would shrink this way, and they would use that shrinkage to lock down on another component to make the joints, even if they were made without glue, which they often were, those joints would never come apart because the components shrank around them. You know, and the thing that's crazy to think about is that green woodworking seems so exotic to us now. But if you go back about 300 years, there was no other kind of woodworking. It was all green because nobody was going to saw up a bunch of boards and leave them in the barn for a year to dry. That would have been an insane waste of resources. And most wood was made from split boards. You'd cut down an oak tree and you would split the boards with wedges, and they weren't sawn at all. And they would go directly from the tree straight into the shop and start making furniture. And that was all of furniture making in the 16th and 17th centuries and before that.
I bet you feel like a time traveler a little bit looking through really examining, because nobody, but most people don't really look that carefully at furniture, especially something old especially if it's been discarded on the side of the road, people don't really care. But it must be fascinating to see some of those signs of like saw marks. And one of the interesting things on that chair was how they left kind of saw marks on there that they just kind of became part of the design. You know, it's like, well, we'll just feature that.
Or if it was where somebody wouldn't see it, it was considered a ludicrous waste of time. Like the inside components, like you can find on some old pieces of furniture, you can find tree bark.
Wow.
Because if you can't see it, they didn't touch it.
Or cheaper types of wood that you had this expanding table. It was like a dining table. I've never seen anything like it before. This thing expanded to
10 feet.
Like 10 feet. Wow.
Amazing.
It was incredible. I don't know how many leaves must have gone in there. It looks like the leaves have been lost over the years.
They were. It looks like 5 leaves. So it would have expanded just enormously. It was insane.
So this would have been built as like a quality piece of furniture, a beautiful piece, but looking through that, you can see that, everything underneath that is a lesser quality wood, and they didn't care about how any of that stuff looked if it wasn't visible.
And it was also just, the customer expectations. Customers did not expect the interior surfaces. I mean, I've been a custom builder. I did that for several years. And these days, there's a huge range of customers. A lot of them are very casual, and some of them will just about break out a magnifying glass. And they'll get under it. And many of today's customers would not accept surfaces like that, even in spots where they couldn't see them. So it has a lot to do with the culture of the time that made that possible.
Was there a lot more leeway? And you've written about this and you've talked about this before, that we seem to be obsessed with precision these days because of power tools. And was there a lot more leeway back, 200 years ago to like, it's flat enough, it's square enough? The thing that we've run into, which is totally understandable, is the post-World War II modern space age mindset, where we've taken science and technology and made them sort of the highest things, and science and technology became about precision. And I'm 100% in favor of both of those things. I am a science guy, and I'm really glad that precision and accuracy and like a rational approach to truth, I'm really glad those things like took over modern industrial society. This is the world that I want to live in. But we also applied those ideas to things where they're not
necessarily useful. Like you can make very fine furniture without measuring things with dial calipers. A guy I like a lot is named Richard McGuire. He's the English woodworker on YouTube. And he once said that anything less than 1/8 of an inch is unmeasurable. And that blew my mind. I was like, wow. Because my granddad was a machinist. He was a tool and die maker he started his apprenticeship in 1914. And he was a machinist up through the 1960s. My dad, it was an amateur auto mechanic, and my brother is a professional auto mechanic. And so I grew up in not just a very mechanical culture with lots of tools, but a lot of focus on precision that was really handed down. So when I started woodworking, I was all machines. I was ultra precise. I really thought about things that way. And it just evolved in a different direction as I started doing it longer.
Right. You come to it with that initial mindset, and then you've kind of grown from that. When did you first start woodworking? How did you get into the whole woodworking scene?
So I graduated from college in 2002. I got a job working for the government, and that was a mind-deadening, soul-destroying experience on every level. Yes. It was like the movie Office Space, except worse.
Oh, no.
Because it wasn't funny. So after 3 years,
and no Jennifer Aniston.
Yeah, and there was no Jennifer Aniston. So after 3 years of riding a desk and realizing that wasn't going to work, I went to graduate school because I had been really good at school, and I wasn't very good at having a white collar office job. So I thought, I'll go back to school. That'll fix my problems, and it didn't fix my problems at all because. Graduate school is a very sort of corporate environment. It's very professionalized. It's looser than having a job, but it's still a pretty tight environment. Still not a lot of leeway or creativity, if I'm being honest. And after a few years in grad school, I was just as unhappy as I had been in a professional job. And sort of out of desperation, just to get away from, I got a degree in English. I have a PhD in English. I would sit and read books for 6 hours, like just literally sit in a chair in the library and read a book for 6 hours. And I have a lot of energy, and I was going out of my gourd. And I don't know why, but for some reason I started to get really interested in building things. I play the guitar, and I had modified a few instruments, and I made a couple guitars out of parts, which is a fun sort of hobby if you play the electric guitar. And at one point, my dad was coming to visit me. I was living down in Florida, and he said, "Hey, do you want a workbench?" And I was like, "Yes, I need a workbench so I can make home repairs and stuff like that." And he brought me a workbench and a drill press and a jigsaw. And it was super generous of him and my mom, and this was stuff he had sitting around, but he brought it down. And just like somebody flipped a switch in my head. Because growing up, I had been around all this mechanical stuff, and I really didn't care. I was interested in drama and fiction and science fiction books. And then when I was older, I played in rock and roll bands. And that's the stuff that I was into. And all of this, fixing tractors and restoring antique cars. And my brother was a certified welder by the time he graduated from high school. Like, all of this stuff was just totally boring to me. I didn't care at all. And then for some reason, I hit 30. And then another thing that happened then, too, is I started seeing Jimmy DiResta's videos on YouTube. And that was the first time that I thought, the fine arts creativity that I like and the mechanical stuff that I grew up with, those actually go together. Like, if you bring an artistic mindset to them, you can use machines and precision and metalworking tools and woodworking tools to make art. That's awesome. I'm going to do that.
I'm on board.
I got really, really excited about it. And that was around probably 2010 that started happening. And I really wanted to do that. And I never in a million years thought it would lead me to doing this stuff full time. But that was absolutely the genesis.
That's fantastic. So was there a point was there like a defining moment for you where you decided to change from being a power tool woodworker to really embracing hand tool woodworking?
No, it was super gradual. My dad gave me a couple of hand planes, which are totally a gateway drug. I brought a couple with me. This is one that he gave me. This is actually the best one I own, my favorite one that I own. It still has the decal from when it was new, and this is from about 1931. And it was just sitting in his basement. And he gave me a couple, and I was sort of fascinated by them, and I liked them. And then Paul Sellers was making videos, and I was watching Paul, and I was like, oh, that's what that thing does. Like, I had a rough idea, but I didn't understand that it could, like, give you a finish on wood where you didn't need to sand. I was like, oh, really? You can plane something and then go straight to finish? That's bananas. I need to learn how to do that. And so for a really long time, I worked in like the Mark Spagnuolo tradition, you know, so I did 90% of my work with machines. I've got a nice saw stop table saw and all that stuff. And then I would do joinery and details using hand tools. And what happened was I started my YouTube channel, and I did a bunch of stuff in the beginning. I think like everybody, I was like, I'm going to do some of this and some of this and some of that. And the hand tool videos did better. People watched them. And it was this interesting cycle where it was like, well, the more of these I do, the more views I get. And then the more I do this stuff, the more the subject of hand tool woodworking like opened like an onion. It was like every layer I got into it, I was like, oh, there's this deeper layer. And then there's this deeper one. And then, oh, there's green woodworking. Oh, and there's Appalachian chair making. And there's 17th century, post and frame construction. Like I kept... And because I have this academic background, I enjoy research and I like reading and I like all of that stuff. And it was a very organic, natural progression. Oh, and the other thing that happened was I stuck my thumb into the blade of my table saw.
Oh, that hurts.
A ton. And I have a saw stop, but I didn't know that you can't use anti-kickback blades in those. It keeps them from working. Now, it still worked. The thing still went off and saved me from grievous injury, but I totally exploded the tip of this thumb, like just blew it apart, and it needed like some pretty significant reconstruction to get it back together. And at that point, that's when I was doing custom work. That's when I was working in furniture shops. Like I was, basically a professional at that point, and I had a lot of experience with lots of saws, and I still did it. And that definitely got the wheels turning in my head too, feeling like, it wasn't because I don't know what I'm doing, and it wasn't because I wasn't paying attention. I had just been working all day. I was on a deadline, and I was trying to get a big project done, and my hand drifted over there, and it just got caught in the blade. And I take full responsibility for it. It was my fault, but it really seemed like an accident that could happen again.
Yeah, it always seems to be that way, isn't it? When you're just tired or rushing or something, that's when the mistakes hurt. And with a hand saw, you got to be pretty determined to cut your finger off.
And I mean, I nick and cut myself with hand tools all the time, but they're tiny little cuts. You usually don't even need a Band-Aid. I've gone to the hospital 3 different times for power tool injuries, and I've never had to go for a hand tool injury.
So other than the safety aspect, I know that's one part of it, and I know this is also a big question, but what is it about hand tools that appeals to you the most?
It's fun and it's low stress. It's quiet. I tell people, I don't mind telling people I have an anxiety disorder. Just general anxiety, but like medically diagnosed. And, being in environments that are really noisy and chaotic can kick up that feeling of anxiousness. And machinery does that to me to an extent. Being in a quiet place and working more quietly is calmer, so I really like that. I do enjoy the history of it a lot. I'm not one of those people who feels like they were born in the wrong time, and I don't want to live in a different era. I really like
the hipster hand tool woodworkers.
Yeah, no, I mean, like I really like antibiotics and dentistry and democracy and all the stuff we have right now. I want to live now, but that way of doing things, it also really appeals to the minimalist side of me. When I was in grad school, actually, I wrote a dissertation about how people in the media industry, like in the film industry or the music industry, if they were underfunded and they wanted to produce something, like the Japanese were really into American style animation, but it's super expensive. and they didn't have the budget for it. And that's one of the things that led to the distinctive style of Japanese anime. And that idea of like not having stuff or having to work with something really basic and still get a result, like that's always fascinated me. I don't know why. And so there's like almost a perversity in thinking like, well, I've got this workbench and a chest of tools and that's it.
Right.
And there's nothing else.
Do you think that at this point, power tool woodworking, which even for the hobbyists, we're getting close to basically almost 100 years people have been doing power tool, that has become the standard traditional woodworking, and that what you're doing is really not so traditional anymore. It's really it's non-traditional. Yeah. Working with hand tools is sort of the indie alt rock of woodworking, I guess. You know?
I'm the Wilco of woodworking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think especially the reason that's true is that in America, we really don't have an unbroken tradition of hand tool woodworking. Right. People who apprenticed and really were the OG hand tool woodworkers, they died before my generation came along to pick it up. And a guy like Paul Sellers, for instance, like the Great Britain held on to its hand tool tradition much longer than we did. But the tradition that he apprenticed in was still an industrial tradition of woodworking. Like all the tools he uses, like this is a factory made tool. This is not a quaint old tool. This is a super modern, very high tech tool that was technically impossible until the late 1800s, which is really recent. You know, a really old tool is more like this one, right?
A wooden plane.
Right, a wooden plane, which the craftsman, this one wasn't made by the craftsman, but it could have been. Like, that's the really, really old way of doing things. There's nobody left in America, especially, who did woodwork from the era where craftsmen made all their own tools. Of course, now that I've said that, somebody's going to contradict me and say, well, actually, it's a true statement in a broad sense.
Yeah, I understand that. And I think that I get the sense that there's more and more hand tool woodwork. Well, it seems to be much more popular today than it was even 10 years ago. And I think that a large part of that is thanks to people like you and Paul Sellers, who are kind of taking this ship forward of, you know, just being in your shop with hand tools. And I think we're getting to the point where we're starting to see hand tools as an option of this is a way to do woodworking that we're defining, rather than it kind of for a while felt like hand tool woodworkers were defining themselves by what they're not. We don't use power tools. We don't use power and pollute the planet and all this other things. But it seems like it's kind of shifting now to where this is just a different avenue with its own assets.
Yeah, it is. And I absolutely still use power tools. I have a bandsaw right next to me. And, you know, look, I'm 41. Sometimes something on me hurts and I don't feel like doing it by hand. I use the bandsaw, which saves a lot of work and is comparatively safe. Like, it's a lot safer than a table saw. So I do a lot of the rough work on that. And for screws and drilling, I use a cordless drill. And I have no intention of giving that up. It's just better. It's better.
But you still use a brace. You still use a brace for drilling holes here and there.
I do, and I still use those too, especially like if I'm going someplace, like if I'm going to a neighbor's house and I might have to drill a hole, and it might be a big one or a small one. Sometimes I'll take a brace and a roll of bits because it's like, well, everything's kind of covered there, and I don't have to worry about the battery. You know, like it really is a great cordless thing. So my friend James Wright, who's also done a lot to popularize hand tool woodworking, he made the point a while ago that we're all hybrid woodworkers now, because even if you do hand tool like I do, your stock has been prepped by machines somewhere. You know, very few of us. I mean, Matt Cremona cuts down his own lumber and makes stuff out of it. He's a
weirdo.
He's doing a different thing than I am. It's very ambitious.
He's on his own planet.
Yeah, I go to a lumber yard and, you know, I buy my lumber from the Amish. And you'd think they were old school, but they're incredibly technically sophisticated. And the lumber I buy from them is dimensioned and planed and kiln dried to perfection. And I get it in the shop and I go to work. So we're all hybrid at that point. You know?
Right. Is it hard for hand tool wood, if you want to go that route, to just find the materials that you need, especially if you're trying to avoid just going to Home Depot and buying wood? I know in one of your it was either a video or article you wrote. One of the like basic things you recommended getting was a stump for using like a hatchet work and stuff. And I think I'm not really sure if I know where to get a stump. I don't know.
Well, there's a couple things. One thing is that, if you're going to do low cost woodworking, using construction lumber is great. And there's so much great old furniture made from pine. Pine was...
So you could like 2x4s or something.
2x4s are great, and I have a bunch of stuff here. Oh, real quick. So here's a milking stool that I made last summer, and it's made completely from just dimensional lumber from the home center. And I made it outside using that stump as the only workbench. And I didn't use any planes or chisels or anything. I used a hatchet and a carving knife and a drill. There's like 10 tools to make it. And you find so many examples of old pieces of furniture that are made out of softwood. So that stuff's fine. And then a lot of the other stuff is just geography. I live in Cleveland, Ohio, which is the most arboreal city in the whole country. It is just covered in trees. So finding lumber around here is easy, but any lumber you would use for power tool work, it's the same lumber you'd use. The only difference is I definitely know power tool woodworkers who love exotics. They love Purple Heart and stuff like that. And I ain't making anything out of Purple Heart.
Why is that?
It's so hard that it's impractical to work by hand. To make a table or something out of that is like, forget it, no way. And I think that's another big topic that that's the big misconception, is people think that if you're hand tool woodworking, you're doing the same thing with a different set of tools. And the reality is machine tool woodworking is its own specific, really effective craft with a set of ways of doing things. And then hand tool woodworking has a totally different way of doing things, a different philosophy and a different mindset that uses hand tools. So if you're a power tool guy and you try to do the same thing using hand tools, you'll destroy yourself.
Right.
Because you'll try to do things that are unrealistic, like work with woods that are too hard, for instance, or over prepare your wood, like prepare it way more than it needs to be for your project. And yeah, you'll wear yourself out. You'll hurt yourself.
When we were talking about precision earlier on, was that a hard transition for you to make, to kind of think of everything as I need to be within a 16th of an inch tolerance, to kind of switching to the hand tools and having much more of a free form approach to it?
I think you get over that the first time you make something really carefully and then the wood moves and your project is ruined because you didn't allow for that. I think you had an early video about making a chessboard. Right. And I think am I right? Your chessboard didn't make it because it moved?
Oh, no, it did.
It did? Okay.
No, it was fine. Yeah, that was my first project on the channel.
I'm thinking of someone else then who made a chessboard and they didn't account for movement and it warped and it kind of fell apart. And I've done stuff before without understanding wood movement, and it sort of fell apart on me or looked bad afterwards. And at that point, my feeling is like, well, it's a dynamic material anyway. Whatever measurement I make today won't be true tomorrow. So it needs to be true enough to make the joint work. And anything beyond that isn't really useful.
Yeah, that's kind of something I've kind of discovered over the years without going the hand tool route, is that I don't need to be as exact about things as I used to think I did. And that for me, it's important to look at the overall finished piece and think about that rather than the individual little pieces of it that nobody's really going to notice. To
be a craftsperson, you have to focus on the details. And I learned this a lot when I was doing custom work. The person who gets the piece takes in the totality of it. They see it like a photograph. They see the whole thing. And if the whole thing has a harmony to it, if it looks proportionate and fits together and all that stuff, they don't even notice the details. They're invisible.
Yeah. You just turn the crappy side to the wall, too.
Well, you know that expression, put your best foot forward?
Yeah,
that actually comes from when guys made candle stands, those round tables with the 3 legs.
Oh, yeah.
When you took it to the customer's house, you would deliberately rotate it so the best of the 3 feet was facing the
Is that right?
That's
Oh,
where
that's
that came
great.
from. And I forget who said it, but somebody said the entire history of woodworking is hiding gaps from customers.
It's kind of
It's
true.
been
Huh?
100% my experience.
Well, how do you define quality woodworking? Is it just mainly lasting
Yeah,
power?
mostly. My biggest thing is function. I want to make pieces that work. So if I make a chair, I want you to be able to sit in it and it be comfortable and it not to break. And if I make a linen chest, I want it to open and close smoothly and hold the stuff it was supposed to hold and stay in one piece. Function is, I think, the top thing that matters. And then after that, aesthetics matter to me a lot. I want things to look good. But my idea of what good is has changed a lot. I used to like decoration a lot more. And now I'm much more interested in like proportion and shape and context, like how things fit in. It's just how you grow as a creative person. You know, like having carvings on something doesn't really excite me anymore. But having really nice angles or having chair legs that splay inward just the right way to make it look a little modern, maybe, you know, that stuff really interests me. So as far as acceptability, I think about function first and then aesthetics. And I'm kind of cognizant of just like my own limitations. I didn't start woodworking until I was 30. And people who were super high-end cabinet makers back in the past, they started when they were 15. And they worked 6 days a week, 10 hours a day. And one of the things I like to do is just be realistic about the level of skill that I'm likely to get to. It's going to be a while yet before I have the skill of like a European master cabinet maker. And I'm not even sure that interests me because a lot of that furniture would look stupid in my house. So there's a style of work that was really prevalent in America called country carpentry. And that was stuff that was made by people who didn't woodwork full time. So like a minister or a farmer or a miller who made furniture half the time. And those people made pieces that I really admire because a lot of them had kind of modest training or maybe no training. Maybe they just kind of picked it up. They usually didn't have great tools. They often worked like out in the barn with the animals, really not perfect circumstances. But up where I live, a lot of those country pieces are still here. And so I like to think like, okay, those people who didn't have the training, the super fancy tools and the perfect shop, they got it done and they made nice pieces. I can take my modest skills, I'm okay, I'm not great, and make stuff that's going to last if I focus on that.
Right. You had an article actually, and this kind of goes back to a thing I mentioned in the introduction. One of the articles on your website was that there is no such thing as woodworking. And just as to your point of these country farmers and whatnot, you making things, it was kind of almost just assumed everybody would be doing some sort of what we call woodworking. But at the time, 200 years ago or prior, there wasn't the term woodworking.
No, it didn't exist. And if you did work with wood, you would have said you're a cooper, you're a wagon maker, you're a cabinet maker, a joiner, a carpenter. There were dozens of professions that used wood because it was the dominant material in everyone's life. There was even a medieval segment of goods called treen, Treen, and treen was entirely bowls, plates, cups, and stuff like that made from wood turned on one of those foot-powered lathes. And there were dudes that's all they did all day, every day, was crank out houseware on a lathe. And that was a whole category of consumer goods.
Yeah, I think I learned a new term too, a bowyer,
Oh, sure.
on that article. I didn't know there were people who specialized in making bows. So it sounds like as a professional, you would have identified just as one of those disciplines that to call yourself a woodworker, and you mentioned this in the article, it would have been like saying, I'm a computer worker today. It's like, well, everybody works with computers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It would have been, it's an anachronistic term. Like it didn't exist. I'd have to look it up. I don't know when the term woodworker came in, but that's something that we invented recently. That would have been a weird
We've
thing
kind
to
of
say.
retconned it back to these old.
Yeah,
old
there was no
times.
such thing as an 18th century woodworker. That's insane. It would have been a cabinet maker or something like that.
And describe to people what a shop would have looked like back then, a furniture making shop, or I guess it would be called a cabinet shop, that probably had a whole staff of people working in it, all doing specific tasks.
It super depends on where you're talking about geographically. Like America was really different than Europe and Great Britain. And so you definitely had the guys that I'm talking about and that I think about a lot, which were the country carpenters who generally worked by themselves, or maybe they had one helper. And then especially if you go to an urban setting, then, and this is another way that hand tools really made sense, is you had apprentices. So an urban cabinet shop, which had a lot of specialization and division of labor, you would have had the master, who was the master because he owned the place, not necessarily because he was the world's greatest craftsperson. And then many journeymen typically working underneath him, and then many more apprentices. And the apprentices did the heavy manual labor, like sawing and planing the rough lumber. And that's another thing that made hand tool work realistic. And it's one of the reasons I'm not afraid to turn on the bandsaw, because the bandsaw is just my apprentice. That handles some of that work. And the journeymen, who did most of what we would consider the precision work, they mostly did the joints. And in a lot of shops, even the head journeyman or the foreman, he would actually mark out the joints and then pass them on to the journeyman to do the cutting. They wouldn't even mark their own joints.
Interesting.
And that, of course, depends a lot on when and where you're talking about and geography and all that stuff.
Sure.
But some of them were very, very big, complex operations with a lot of tools. And you might have somebody in that shop who literally all they did was carving, and literally all they knew how to do was carving. They apprenticed as a carver, and all they did was carve all day, every day. And they didn't know how to build a case or how to make legs or how to work the lathe.
Would they have considered themselves artisans, or is that just a term we apply to them?
It's a good question. I don't really know the answer. I know that they would have considered themselves tradesmen, and they would have said that was the trade that they practiced. And especially in Europe, they would have belonged to a guild, and that would have conferred a level of status in society. So you were definitely above a peasant farmer. If you were a tradesman who worked for a guild, that was a big step up the ladder. And belonging to a guild gave you a level of legal protection. Even if the local lord was very powerful, he didn't want to get in a fight with the stonemasons union. He would prefer not to. He'd probably win, but it allowed relatively common people to have some social standing they wouldn't have had otherwise.
Hey, your articles on your website are really good.
Oh,
it looks like you do them about once a month or so, and a lot of thought goes into those. Would you ever consider making video essays using those? I think they would be fantastic.
Well, this is a great time to talk about how I just recently released my second book.
Everyday Woodworking.
It's called Everyday Woodworking, and you can buy it anywhere you get books, probably Amazon. And it's doing really well. It's sold out its first printing, actually, and this is printing number 2. And it teaches you how to get going in woodworking with 12 hand tools, and none of them are complicated. No planes, no chisels, no fancy saws, really basic stuff. Most of the stuff you can find at the home center. So Everyday Woodworking is available wherever you get books. I have thought about video essays and stuff like that, and I've definitely thought about branching out a little bit. I've been doing this for 5 years, and I am flirting with the burnout a little bit. I don't have any plans to stop doing what I'm doing, but you've been doing this a lot longer than I have. How long did it take you to start feeling like, whoa, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep doing this?
Yeah, it happens all the time. But what I do is I just keep changing it up. There's that expression, no matter where you live, that people always say, well, if you don't like the weather, just wait a few minutes and it'll change. Everybody says that. And it's sort of like my channel. I feel like, well, if you don't really like what I'm doing now, wait about a year and I'll be doing something completely different. I think for me, it's just, I've got to keep just changing it up. Otherwise, you will get kind of burned out.
I think I have a series called Woodwork for Humans, which is the very basic approach, using a bench to build yourself and all that stuff. I think one of the things I'm up against is that series of videos that really drove the popularity of my channel and sort of made me, put me on the map. That's kind of drawing to a sort of natural conclusion, because I've sort of solved all the problems I set out to solve. And anybody who's been following that, they have a bench and a workspace and a set of tools. And now I'm to the point where the only thing really left to do with that series is just keep making projects. And if I'm being totally honest, the projects are the least interesting part for me. I like building furniture, but what I really like doing is problem solving and coming up with different ways to do things. And I love it when my viewers are like, well, I want to do X, but I don't have any of the stuff you have. Here's what I have. And that sort of problem of like, wow, how can that person make furniture with those 5 tools on their back porch? How can I figure? That's really fun. I like building furniture a lot, but it's not as fun. And what happened early in the channel is I was using my Stanley planes a lot, which I love. And I thought anybody could go to the flea market and buy Stanley planes. Here's another one that I use every day. I bought this plane for $5. And I grew up in Connecticut. There's tons of this stuff. Stanley was a Connecticut company, so there's like thousands and thousands of Stanley planes. And I thought everybody could just go to a tag sale and buy a hand plane for nothing. And a lot of people commented to me and they said, oh, we don't have those where I live. I live in Arizona or I live in Texas, and I can't go to the flea market and buy a hand plane. We just don't have them. What can I do? And that really got me going and thinking, wow, how are we going to do this? And that drove a lot of stuff. But then I kind of worked through all of those problems. And so I think what you just said, it's time to start taking things.
Well, like I said, I really enjoy the furniture forensics, but then you've got to find the old furniture, I guess, to be able to do that. And then I think, do you pay a lot of attention to the YouTube analytics and what people are watching and what they want to watch? None of that.
I did for a while, and the reality is I just can't be bothered. As long as I'm putting things out and they're getting views at a certain level, I have to admit the game of YouTube has become intensely boring to me.
It is. You're just chasing this non-existent algorithm.
And you can see the progression of my channel. My titles and my thumbnails have gotten more clickbaity as time has gone on. There's a lot more thumbnails of me going making thumbnail face.
The YouTube scream face.
Yeah. I do that a lot.
I don't know what people are always screaming about on their thumbnails.
And I care a lot about never making misleading thumbnails because that really bothers me. So I never do that. But I end up trying to hype things that just aren't hype worthy. They're good, they're worth watching, but they're not mind blowing. It's not like this one trick is going to revolutionize. None of those things apply to sharpening a chisel. Right? That's just, here's a skill. It's really worth knowing. I can even make it fun, but I can't make it that exciting. It's not that exciting. And YouTube is so built on hype, and that's why I'm branching out into books, and I've got a course coming out in December. And, I'm going to do a little less YouTube as time goes on because it is a hype factory, and trying to make hand tool woodworking hype worthy is just like a hollow pursuit. It's
that's tough sell.
It's disingenuous, and the thing that I do is it's really valuable, even if it's not a flashing neon sign. It's a wonderful art form that gives a lot of people meaning in their lives, but it's not fireworks. It's a different thing.
Well, it looks like you've got a pretty strong following over on Patreon too. So it looks like that's doing pretty well.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate with Patreon. I'm almost in the top 100 creators on that platform.
Man, that's amazing.
And it's not false modesty for me to say I'm really not sure why that is. I totally understand why I have some following on Patreon, but I'm getting close to 4,000 patrons. And I have to admit, I find that a little bit mysterious. I think part of it is that for a really long time, my lowest tier on Patreon was $2. And so the barrier to entry was just so low, people decided to sign on for $2. And then when I do a project, I always release plans for sale, but my patrons get the plans for free. And so a lot of people do the math and they just think, well, I'll be a patron and get all these plans for free. And then what happens is I have a discussion forum that luckily is very well attended. It has thousands of people in it and gets a ton of traffic. And a lot of people show up to get free plans, and then they sign on to the discussion forum and they start having discussions, and then they never leave.
So as a hand tool woodworker, are all of your plans designed on pencil on a napkin, or do
No, I have a young fellow who works for me who is an architect, and he designs everything in Fusion 360 and then exports it into 16 other programs that I don't know anything about. I totally don't understand what he's doing. We sit down together and outline the plans very carefully, and I'm involved in building the digital model of whatever it is. But then the actual mechanics of it, I did my own plans for years. I just stopped this year, and I did them in SketchUp. And I have no background in design or you were a graphic designer, weren't you? That's a huge asset for this field. So I have a designer who works for me, I have an editor, and I have a 3D designer. And I have another guy who helps me with organizational stuff. So I've got kind of a big team for not having a huge channel. But I basically taken those people to outsource the stuff that I was really limping by on. Like, I'm not a good designer. I'm not a very good editor. I'm really good at talking and writing. And I'm trying to do more talking and writing. I'm a language person. And try to outsource the other stuff.
And you got a great voice.
I appreciate that.
It really works well.
Yeah, so it's funny how I kind of thought I was leaving the writing stuff behind when I left academia, and then it's just come back so much, and it's become so clear to me like what my skills are. I really started my channel hoping to be in the mode of guys like Jimmy DiResta and of Matthias and of John Heiss and some of the early guys like that who made these mind-blowing things that were crazy. And you can see some of my early videos, I'm like trying to do that, and that's not really me. I don't have a visual arts background. I know a lot about music, and I know a lot about writing and fiction writing and all of that stuff, but I'm not really a visual artist. And it's funny how this whole process has just brought me back to the core of what I am anyway, which is mostly a writing, talking person.
What was your experience like writing that book, at least your most recent one on everyday woodworking? Is that something, do you enjoy the process? I like asking this question because I've talked to a number of authors and I get sort of a wide range of responses.
I hated writing that book.
Yeah.
Hated it.
I get that a lot from people, yeah.
And the main reason was because how-to books require an enormous amount of work to do the photography, integrate the photographs. You probably think, oh, the publisher does that for you. No, the publisher does not. You have to go in and with a very, very specific formatting, tell them exactly where each picture goes, like in between which word and which other word. And they're very exacting on how you have to present it to them. And people probably also think, oh, the publisher helps you with photography. No, they don't, not remotely. They won't even edit photos that you give them. Whatever you give them is what goes into the book. And if they do need anything like that, you have to pay for it. So how-to books are awful to produce, because you have to write the whole thing, then you have to take hundreds of photographs, pick the right ones, edit them, color correct them, and then put them in. I mean, I spent as much time doing the photography and the formatting as I did writing the thing. So people probably aren't going to be happy to hear this, but I think it's very unlikely I'll ever write another how-to book. Especially because woodworking is a small enough niche that once you've written the book, there's a limit to how many you can sell. And a standard royalty for a book like this is 10%. So look at whatever the cover price of the book is right now. When you buy it, I get 10% of that.
Right. Yeah.
It's not a great business proposition.
No, I think that's why a lot of people just don't really bother, or they self-publish their own books, and then a lot of times just use those as just sort of a way of attracting people to their other products that they're selling. Yeah,
I have.
I think unless you're like Stephen King or something, it's pretty hard to make a living as a writer.
Well, I have no doubt that I'll write more books and probably even more books about woodworking, but they'll be much more text heavy. So I like the history a lot, so I'll probably write books more about the history of woodworking and books more about like how to think about it as opposed to how to do it. Because if you can kind of get the right mindset, a lot of the other things sort of follows naturally.
Do you think that it's a hard sell to get people who've never done any woodworking to start in with hand tool woodworking? And I ask this because it almost invariably seems to be that power tool woodworking is the default and people start with that and then they graduate to hand tool woodworking.
To the extent that I care about making an argument about that, like to the extent that I want to influence anybody, I would say, listen, it's way safer and you don't have to worry about dust collection or anything. Like you're not going to have sawdust sprayed in your face by a router or whatever. And that especially when you're first starting out, it's very inexpensive. A couple $100 buys you a nice kit of basic tools and you can make all sorts of basic projects around the house and do home repairs. So that stuff is really fine. And the other thing, if people ask me, like, I'm going to get into it, but I'm not sure which direction I'd go, the thing I say to people is I know lots of woodworkers who started out with machines and ended up all hand tool. I've literally never met a woodworker who started hand tool and then went in the machine direction.
Right.
Lots of people start machine and stay machine, which I completely understand. I like the machine way too. But I've never met somebody who does that. And I think it's just something that I can't really explain. Something happens with your brain as you're pursuing the craft and as you're doing the hand tool woodworking. It tickles something. And if you're the sort of person who likes that feeling, you keep pursuing it and going deeper and deep. And it's like you're trying to get to something. Like I feel that all the time. Like I'm trying to get at something in my work. And I don't know what it is. And I don't even know if I'll know when I find it. But by like constantly stripping it down and studying these old ways of doing things and trying to make things as basic and simple as possible, I'm like getting closer and closer and closer to something.
Yeah, I think that people like you are able to kind of bring the philosophy back, which I don't think that people who start with power tools, they have a philosophy. I mean, frankly, what we want to do is we're more focused on the end product. We just want to see this thing built. And hey, look what I did. I made this cool little end table that I can put in my bedroom rather than fully enjoying that process. And I say that as a guy who I do enjoy the process of power tool woodworking, but I can definitely see the appeal of the quiet isolation of working alone with a draw knife.
Well, I imagine also your approach is somewhat dictated by your business. You do more projects, I think, than anyone I know, whereas I do a comparatively small number of projects. Mm-hmm. And since you've sort of established that rhythm, it really makes sense for you to stick with the way you do things because it lets you put out, especially when you were putting out a lot of projects, it let you crank them out fast.
Yeah, now those projects people aren't interested in projects. That's another thing about YouTube. It's just getting really hard for people to watch projects.
And they take so much more. I did a video just recently that was just me talking about workbenches and how to not make 5 big mistakes on workbenches.
Right.
That thing's on.
I love that video.
Yeah, thank you. That video is on the verge of 1 million views.
Yeah.
Right. Which makes it like my 6th or 7th most popular video ever. Whereas a video where I made this really meticulously researched Spanish mission style bench that I reconstructed from one photograph from inside an actual Spanish mission. I made it completely with nails. There's no glue in it. And it's not very difficult and it doesn't take much wood. So it's like really historical and it looks great and it's not that hard. And that video did okay. Not bad.
Yeah.
Not great. I don't think it crested 100,000 yet.
It's a little disappointing though when you put a heart and soul into a project and then nobody's really interested in it. But I'm the same way. I know I can crank out the 5 best ways to do this or the 5 things you need to do that. And those kind of videos, people are just way more interested in watching that kind of stuff. And I think it may just be because YouTube has gotten so saturated with projects. If you need to build a certain project, it's already there. There's not really much anybody else can add to that mix. So why not just, and if people are watching woodworking videos, they're just looking for these little bitty tips that maybe they can put in their back pocket for some other time.
Yeah, I can draw a really great parallel to that too, to like being a musician. I play guitar and I play a couple other instruments, and I've done that since I was 16. And when I first started playing, what I loved was learning songs. And a lot of that was just learning where to put your fingers and learning things by shapes. And if I could play a song that I liked, I was happy. That was great. And that stopped being interesting after a couple of years. And, I still play my instrument and I still improve as a musician. And now what I really like is music theory. Stuff that was too dry to even contemplate when I first started out. Like, you could not get me near theory. I played rock and roll music. I played in a band. You can stick all that theory stuff. I don't want to know. And I didn't even learn to read music until my mid-30s or early 30s. Oh, wow. And now that's what interests me way more than anything. And I think woodworking's like that too. You want to make those projects. You want to say, I made our coffee table. And then after a while, you're like, well, I've made a few projects. Where did this stuff come from? Mm-hmm. Like, that table I made looks like this other thing. Oh, that's a shaker style. What the heck is a shaker? And maybe you go down that rabbit hole. Oh, the other thing I meant to say that's really important, since we're talking about hand tool, power tool stuff, is when you're doing hand tool woodwork, the projects you do are really determined by the fact that it's hand tool work. So I pretty much only make reproduction furniture, which sounds like it would be boring, but I find it super fascinating. And I only make pieces that would have been made by hand. So if you have a guy like Chris Salamone, who does amazing, beautiful mid-century modern furniture, for him to do that stuff by hand would be absurd. Right. That would be stupid. Right? Because there's so many curves and compound angles and crazy stuff. That's a machine genre of woodworking. That is machine work. I'm sure he uses a chisel or whatever from time to time, but he's basically making factory furniture in an artisanal setting. Right. And
yeah, it would be like, to your music analogy, trying to get a string quartet to play some EDM or something.
It just doesn't make sense. It's incoherent. Right. And so that's another thing that I want to tell people. And most people, I think, when they get started in this, they're like, well, I want to make furniture in every style. And I'm like, yes, you do, but that probably won't last. Like, you'll probably hone in on a style or a time period that you like, and you'll probably specialize. I make early American furniture. And that's what I like. And I make other stuff sometimes, but I mostly make early American furniture.
Would you consider making an acoustic guitar?
I've thought about it, but what's funny about that is I am a lousy acoustic guitar player. I suck at it, and I'm not good at it. I'm a pretty decent electric player, but it's sort of that same analogy. Like, playing electric guitar is really different than playing acoustic guitar. And I'm a pretty decent electric guitar player, and I'm all thumbs on the acoustic. I mean, I can bang out some chords, but I'm not good.
Did you play that little jingle on your channel at the beginning of every video?
What's funny is the disparate responses I have to that. Like,
oh, really?
Yeah. So I had one guy who was a professional musician email me and tell me, that thing is terrible. You need to let me re-record something that doesn't sound so bad. And I very politely told him to screw off. I said, look, I'm not a professional musician, but I happen to like that just fine. Thank you very much. It's exactly what I want it to sound like. And then a couple of weeks later, I had a professor of music theory email me just to tell me he thought that it was, quote, a brilliant piece of performance. And he loved it, and he listened to it all the time. And I was like, there you go. And I mean, listen, I'm not a professional musician. I have like sort of modest abilities at that, just like in furniture making, but I happen to like my own playing. Like,
it's a great little jingle too. It defines every one of your videos.
And what's funny about that is, like, that's when I was running things really on a shoestring, and I was able to create the animation for that by stringing together a couple different pieces of free software that weren't designed to do that. And I got the animation looking just right. And then I just had to sit there and play guitar while I watched it on a loop until I came up with something that fit the timing, because it had been so difficult to get the animation made that I couldn't change anything.
Right.
So whatever it was, I had to play to that timing, and that's what I did.
You probably did that process backwards, didn't you?
100%.
You should record the music
and
first.
now, and I know a lot of people do this the opposite way, but my videos are totally driven by, like, I write a script for every one of them.
Yeah.
And I record the narration first, and then my editor edits all the clips to fit the narration. Whereas I know a lot of people do an edit that looks good and they talk over it. And every time I've tried to do that, it's been garbage. I can't do that for whatever reason. I have to start with the words.
So do you have any plans for the channel coming up in the near future? Anything new you want to share?
Yeah, I have a whole new workbench. It's a big part of my channel, and I have...
You've built a number of workbenches, haven't you?
Yeah, it's one of the biggest things people care about, and I also am endlessly fascinated by workbench technology. They're so different from one another, and they work so differently. So it tickles that spot in my brain. But I have one coming up that is I'm looking at it. It's right over there. It's a knockdown bench. It breaks down into 6 really manageable pieces, and you can put it apart. You can put it together and take it apart with no tools. You just need like a scrap of wood to knock some pegs in with. You don't even need a mallet. It costs about $260 to make. And you can do it with very basic woodworking skills. So that's going to come out in December. And it's going to have a course attached to it. And we just finished the plans. The plans are like 36 pages long, all designed in Fusion 360, and they look really beautiful. And so that's the big thing I have coming for the holidays. And then next year, just like you and I have been talking about, I'm thinking about kind of rebooting things a tiny bit and seeing how else I can inject some of that enthusiasm back into it for myself, maybe by trying to make things even smaller and more limited. The big like constituency of people I haven't reached yet is people who live in apartments.
Oh, right.
There's a lot of people who live in apartments who want to do woodworking. And a lot of them have said to me, like, we need you to design a system for us. And I've been working on that for about a year now. And so... Because
it would generally be quiet, except for some pounding, I guess, would be the...
Yeah, and, you know, like, you
occasional. That's a very...
You can drill it out to get most of the way there. You know, so yeah, there'd be some pounding. But people do. I mean, if you live in Japan or in a city in Germany, like, there are people who build furniture in their living room. It seems crazy to me because I grew up on a farm. Like, we had a barn and a basement and a garage. Like, there was plenty of spaces to do that stuff. But I live in a smallish house in Cleveland, Ohio now, and I have a little yard, and I kind of understand that better. And so I think the thing for me to really do is to come up with like a whole system of woodworking for people who live in apartments.
That's a fantastic untapped market, I would say.
Thanks. I'm glad you think so.
Go for it, man. That sounds fantastic. Well, Rex, this hour went by really fast. I'm going to have you on again because I wanted to ask you some other questions. We didn't even get into the whole thing about Japanese style woodworking that I know you've got some opinions on.
I got opinions on everything, man.
It seems to be like kind of almost this romantic notion. I see a lot of Japanese woodworking and it's kind of fetishized in a way.
You know, I just had Roy Underhill on. I do a series for my patrons where it's basically this, but it's just for my patrons. And you had him on too, didn't you?
Yeah, I asked him about the Japanese.
Well, and he said, I asked him about it too, and he said, well, he said, I don't really know anything about it except they're really into it, aren't they? And I said, you know, I wonder if that's true, or I wonder if that's Western woodworkers making the Eastern woodworkers exotic. Maybe we're putting that on them. And if you actually got a Japanese furniture maker and talked to him, he'd really, or her, they'd just be like, man, we're trying to get this stuff out the door and get paid. What are you talking about?
Isn't that the truth? Isn't that the truth? I mean, because I get comments from people who will say things like that, and they always refer to these Japanese videos where these guys are making these super complex joinery or something. And it's like, well, that's really easy for the way you do it. You should see this video link here. The guy who can do it with no screws or no glue. Or like, you're just... Yeah.
That's also very, like, that no screws and no glue thing is very unimpressive because European furniture didn't have glue or fasteners for like centuries. So that doesn't move any mountains with me. I don't care if you don't use screws or nails. I don't most of the time either.
Yeah.
So this has been, I just have to say, it's been an enormous pleasure talking to you. You were one of the first guys I watched. I watched your super early videos where you had a 5 o'clock shadow in all the videos. And I remember really early on you saying, like, you need to get a table saw because this hand saw, this is not going to get the job done. You're not going to use this. And I was like taking notes. I was like, oh, shoot, I need a table saw.
And now them's fighting words.
Well, they're not fighting words. It's just different ways. But I remember that so clearly. And I remember you holding up the saw from the home center and me looking at it and thinking, look at that piece of garbage. Of course he's right. You're not going to use that. That's absurd. And it's funny how long things have gone, but the the fact that you wanted to chat about this stuff, people sometimes leave comments where they think you and I must be enemies or something.
Oh no!
Well, because we have different.
I love what you do.
I always tell people, no, I'm actually a huge fan of Steve's stuff. He makes great videos.
I think it's fantastic. I am enamored with your videos and with your philosophy towards it's the same as I had with Roy Underhill. I watched Roy Underhill for years when I was real young, and I just always loved that, but it's never something that I would do personally, but it's something I really appreciate, and I appreciate the whole philosophy behind it, really.
We're incredibly fortunate that we live in an age where if you want to pursue the craft, there are options.
Yeah.
There used to be, if it was 100 years ago, there was one way to be a furniture maker. You'd get apprenticed to somebody local and they would teach you the right way to do every single thing. And you don't have to do that anymore. We live in an era of choice.
It certainly wasn't a hobby back then.
Yeah, well, about 100 years ago, it actually was.
About 100 years ago would have been, when it would have started.
Which, that's another thing that that would make a great book. I know we have to stop, but this is the last thing I'm going to say. That would make a great book is how did woodworking turn from a trade into a hobby? And why did Why did this blue-collar trade become a hobby for gentlemen? I have no idea how that happened, and I'm quite curious.
See, I want to see these video essays on your channel. I mean, these are fantastic topics that I find interesting. I don't know if other people would be as enamored with them as I am, but I would keep watching every week.
You're a guy who knows how to get views on this platform, so if you think it'd be interesting, I'm probably going to take that advice. Maybe I will. I know my editor would be up for it. He really likes that sort of thing.
No, if you want to get views, make them in 60 seconds and put them in a vertical format.
I want to get the views that get money.
There you go.
Views, so.
Hey, I get money off of those shorts every month. I get like that $100 check or something.
Steve, this has been a pleasure. I know you have a busy day, so I'm not going to take up any more of your time. Thanks so much for having me on. It's been delightful.
Oh, you're welcome. And I really want to thank you for joining me. I think this has been enlightening for listeners who maybe you've never even considered working with hand tools, and maybe you might want to give it a shot. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Have a great day. Bye.